You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we've got a surprise ruling in court today that pours some cold water on Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill that was just passed. Can you explain what happened?
Yeah, Brian, a federal judge just issued a TRO, a temporary restraining order for 14 days, blocking a part of the so-called, big, beautiful, ugly bill that was just signed into law by Donald Trump in recent days. Specifically, in the bill, there is a 1-year freeze on all Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood, although they don't use the term Planned Parenthood in the legislation. Clearly, that was the target of this 1-year freeze because it's, health organizations that primarily perform abortion or provide abortion-related services. So listen, they are trying to freeze out Planned Parenthood. So suit was brought saying, look, this violates equal protection of the law. This is basically a backdoor approach to try to ban abortions. They say that more than 1 million Medicaid recipients get health care services from Planned Parenthood. And they make a point to say, listen, it's not just abortions. They do cancer screenings. They treat sexually transmitted diseases. There are lots of reasons that Medicaid money should continue to go to support these kind of services. And they basically say, look, you're discriminating. You're trying to just de facto shut down Planned Parenthood. This is another way to try to defund Planned Parenthood. And they persuaded a federal judge that at least there should be a temporary restraining order for 14 days while the judge considers whether she should extend that, maybe make it a preliminary injunction, which can last much longer than a temporary restraining order.
Glenn, the ultimate hypocrisy here is that all of these Republicans claim that when Roe was overturned, that they wanted these decisions to be left up to the states. The states can determine where they want to allocate their funding, and if they choose to allocate their funding to Planned Parenthood, then that's their prerogative to be able to do so. And yet, once again, we have these Republicans who have decided that, in fact, they have no interest in leaving it all up to the states. They want to be able to dictate what happens at the highest levels of government all the way down to the most local levels of government.
Yeah, hypocrisy is not really a thing in the Republican Party or as far as the, 6-justice majority of the Supreme Court is concerned. But, this will do real harm not only to literally thousands of Planned Parenthood organizations, but to the many people, the more than 1 million people who use Medicaid to, get some of these health-related services. So, it's really a lose-lose proposition. And the only ones who win, I guess, are the, kind of radical ideologues who seem forever to want to be the ones who make women's reproductive health decisions for them.
Right. What about the issue that the Supreme Court ruled that courts can't issue temporary restraining orders or nationwide injunctions that apply to the whole country? When we have a situation with Planned Parenthood, Planned Parenthoods are, of course, around the entire country. So does that fall into that category, or because Planned Parenthood is a unique entity? Yes, they might have branches everywhere, but they are a specific entity. You're still allowed to have judges who can issue temporary restraining orders as it relates to this entity.
Brian, that's a great question. And I think the answer is not easy, not intuitive, and not even settled, given the very recent ruling by the Supreme Court, basically outlawing nationwide preliminary injunctions. But let's work through it. First of all, this is not a preliminary injunction. This is a temporary restraining order, which is a very short duration. Indeed, so short that you can't typically even appeal a judge's decision to enter a temporary restraining order. But the other thing is, the temporary restraining order that was at issue there had to do with executive branch power. It had to do with an attempt by Donald Trump to unconstitutionally revoke the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship. This doesn't have anything to do with executive power. This is really heartland federal judiciary stuff. What I mean by that is the judge looked at a brand new federal statute that was just passed and just signed into law and deemed that some portion of it violates potentially the Constitution and the rights of the plaintiffs who sought this brief temporary restraining order while the issue gets more fully fleshed out. So, there are a couple of different ways to see how, this temporary restraining order might not really run afoul of the Supreme Court's recent ruling saying, you know what, no more nationwide injunctions. Of course, even that ruling, Brian, courts have been finding ways to work around it legitimately, and indeed in ways that the Supreme Court opinion itself suggested were still available options, like class action lawsuits and deciding issues based on the Administrative Procedure Act and ruling that something that the government did was unlawful and there should be a stop put to it. So it's a great question. It's a question that I don't think we have an available answer to yet, given that the Supreme Court's ruling is so new.
Okay, well, look, the issue that we're focused on here is whether or not Planned Parenthood will be defunded by virtue of this provision in Trump's big, beautiful bill. Based on what you read in the ruling, does what the plaintiffs brought forward here seem to be a strong enough case that it would be able to survive scrutiny beyond just this temporary restraining order, that it would be able to survive scrutiny on the merits in this trial court and the appellate court and the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it's a great question, but let me first say, when you say I've read the ruling, I indeed have read the ruling, and it's about a page and a half. There is no analysis. It is simply saying that the judge believes that this brief temporary restraining order should be put in place for 14 days, and she directs that, members of the executive branch, the Trump administration, be notified within, I think, 72 hours that the Medicaid money may not stop flowing to Planned Parenthood. But we don't have an analysis yet. We'll probably learn more in the coming days. But here's the thing. This really feels like legislation that purports to be one thing, but is really disguising its true intentions. And I did read about some of the arguments that Planned Parenthood made when they were applying for this TRO. They said, look, this is a backdoor way to ban abortion, which is now something that has gone back to the states. They say this is really violating Planned Parenthood's right to equal protection of the laws, because even though they don't use the name of the organization, it is clear, and it's clear that they've been wanting to defund Planned Parenthood. Well, you know what? Our government can't be in the business of passing laws that specifically target a disfavored business that is not only not doing anything unlawful, but is providing important medical services, including reproductive health care, to the American people. So, I think they have some really good, what I would call equitable arguments that make a lot of sense to me. The question will become, do those arguments win the day on sort of the lawfulness and the constitutionality front? And I think we really need to await more complete briefing and perhaps some more court hearings before that landscape becomes a little bit more clear.
Do you have any concern that, because we've seen this happen before, that even though there is legally allocated funds to an organization like Planned Parenthood, and even though it's the prerogative of the legislative branch to be able to allocate those funds, and if a judge says that you can't block the lawful allocation of those funds, is there any concern that the executive branch, that Donald Trump will try to impound these funds anyway and prevent legally allocated funding from going to these organizations that, to your exact point, may just be disfavored by the Republican Party?
Brian, I would be surprised if Donald Trump didn't attempt something like this, because when you even raise that, my mind immediately goes to Donald Trump improperly leveraging congressionally appropriated funds that were supposed to go where? To Ukraine, to help President Zelensky fight against the unlawful Russian aggression. Congress had already allocated those funds for that purpose. Donald Trump had no right to grab hold of them, figuratively put them in his back pocket, and say, I know you want this money and I know you're entitled to it, but I want a favor, though. I want you to gin up a bogus investigation into my political opponent. If he was willing to do that, why would he not do it all over again, perhaps in this arena?
Right, and I think it's just a matter of time before he actually tries to do that. It's funny because they'll try to go through the courts to give themselves a veneer of legitimacy, like, okay, we're following the proper channels, but if and when they get a ruling that doesn't satisfy them, they'll just be like, screw it, we'll just do whatever we want anyway. And so if they get a ruling they like, then they'll follow the courts and they can say, look, we went through the proper channels, and if they get a ruling they don't like, they'll say, you know what, the courts are illegitimate, we have the angry Democratic judges who are helping the Biden administration and the Obama administration, and we shouldn't listen to those people anyway, so we'll just do whatever we want to do. And of course, none of these other Republican lackeys in the legislative branch or even at the Supreme Court are going to say anything if and when they do that. But look, as it relates
but here's
to...
the good news, Brian. We're going to know pretty quickly whether the Medicaid funds were frozen or whether they thawed out and they kept going to Planned Parenthood, because I can guarantee that will very quickly become not only apparent to Planned Parenthood if the Medicaid funds have been stopped, but that will be a matter of supplementing, the court filings, and we're all going to hear about that, I would suspect, in the coming days.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. For those who are watching, if you want to follow along with this case and any other legal cases, please make sure to subscribe. That's the best way to support our work. It is completely free to subscribe to both of our channels, so if you're not yet subscribed, go ahead and do that. Again, the links are right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.